There goes a car, making a big noise. You would think if I come out to a place like this that there wouldn't be that much traffic. Oh well. Hello and welcome back to the Okanagan Reader. I'm your host, Jim Bowering. Today's reading is Chapter 31 of Green Comet, the first book in the Green Comet trilogy. And there goes a couple more cars. One coming the other way. We'll just wait for it to pass by. Okay, in Chapter 31, the Comet is in shock and in danger of an epidemic of suicides after learning about the destruction of their, well, pretty well their entire species, really. They think about getting hold of Orange Comet. There wasn't that much traffic when I came up here. The only other one that is comparable to their own. Orange Comet left before they did, and it's also a big one. In spite of the risk that the visitor might detect it, they decide to send a message. It's the declaration of their continued existence, and it's worth the danger. So here's another bit of Okanagan scenery behind me. I'm hoping that you're picking it up pretty well. And that handsome fella there is not blocking too much of the view. Okay, here we go then.
Chapter 31, Communication. Green Comet was a dark place and cold. They hadn't touched the environmental controls. No one had turned down the lights. It was just colder and darker. It was a quieter place, too. There were no voices calling out across the square, no children shouting and laughing. When people spoke, it was quietly, and no longer than absolutely necessary. The cold and darkness in Green Comet were coming from inside the people. There was one suicide during the extermination of their species. It happened before the poisoning of the planet, while it was still possible to hope. Someone abandoned hope before it was gone and escaped into death. There were a few more suicides after the planet was sterilized, and then a small wave of them as the horrible reality sank in. It began to look as if it would become a trend. People who might have been merely morbidly depressed were seeing other people kill themselves and deciding that it must be a viable option. Francis and Winston saw the developing trend and moved to cut it off before it turned into a self-supporting system. They spoke on the public address system. They spoke at the funerals of the suicides. They eulogized their martyred planet and included the suicides among the victims of the visitor. They tried to turn minds away from the horror, away from the past and onto the future. That was all they had now, and their only option was to go on, to survive. They needed to be strong to defy the brutal intentions of their heartless destroyer. The suicide stopped at 31. Given the circumstances, 31 out of 2,000 was probably not bad. They didn't have any precedents to compare it to, because there had never been a comparable situation. There was the Great Comet disaster with its destruction and loss of life, but there was no intent or agency behind it, so it was different. There was the Yellow Comet case, where the agency and intent were clear, but it was localized, and from this perspective small. The loss of one's entire species and its planet of origin to a silent and implacable enemy was unprecedented. The only possible comparison would be Orange Comet, if they ever felt safe enough to try to contact them. "I think it's safe," said Francis. "We should be able to send a message to Orange Comet without being detected." "You think?" said Winston. "We need more assurance than thinking it should be okay." Some of the heads around the table were nodding. The horror was so fresh, their isolation and vulnerability so real, that they were inclined to reject anything that might attract the attentions of the visitor. "You'll need to make a good case for it before we break radio silence." So Fran explained about the relative positions of Green Comet, Orange Comet, and the inner system. "We form a triangle," she said. "If we send a tight beam to Orange Comet, it will be angled away from the inner system where they all are, and even farther away from the main vessels still approaching. How do we know they're all in the inner system? How do we know they only came from one direction? How do we know anything? We can't know anything for sure, of course, said Francis. For all we know, there might be many visitors approaching from all directions at once. They might have already discovered and destroyed Orange Comet, and they're just waiting for us to give away our positions so they can destroy us. She smiled at Winston, who, to his credit, laughed. It was brief and weak, but it still showed that he saw her point. She went on, but we only ever saw the flashes coming from one direction, so I think it's safe to say that there is only one visitor. Okay, he said. We can agree that one visitor came from one direction, so the chances are that Orange Comet is still safe. The people around the table gave tacit assent to that. But those smaller modules that it deployed, they were moving fast, and there were a lot of them. Who's to say that one of them didn't go straight through the system? It could be within the target area of a signal we send, couldn't it? Yes, it could, she said. We tried to piece together what happened from the information we were able to gather, and we think we can account for the movements of most of the visitors' modules. That's including the few that were destroyed. She shook her head. But there are uncertainties. It was a chaotic time, and we had to make some educated guesses. You are right to assume a finite probability that one or more modules left the inner system. Probabilities, said Winston. It's always probabilities, isn't it? He made a disgusted face. Just once I'd like to work with some certainties. Be careful what you ask for, said Fran. Certainties are so often terrible. Yes, you're right, said Winston with a shudder. They usually are. He smiled wryly at her. I guess I'll stick with the probabilities. They're probably the less evil of the options. Francis started a video. I got Buzzard's guy to make this for me. It's based on Buzzard's math and a lot of estimates, so you'll have your fill of probabilities. It began by showing their position. Green Comet, shown in green, was beyond the termination shock, where the wind from their sun was slowed down below supersonic speed, but not as far as the heliopause, where it's overcome completely by the interstellar wind. The ecliptic, where all the planets orbited, was shown, as was the orbit of their comet at an angle of 54 degrees to it. They were shown above the ecliptic, as it was customary to display north as up, but not too far, since they were still so close to perihelion. They were twice as far out as the outer edge of the Kuiper belt, but only a small fraction as far as the Oort cloud, which was shown in an inset. The view backed up and rotated left to show the visitor, displayed in a menacing black, at the inner edge of the Kuiper belt. It was a few degrees below the ecliptic, and inbound on a radial about 40 degrees away from them. Red Comet could be seen just within the inner system, inbound fatally close to the visitor's course. The view backed up again, and rotated right until it included Orange Comet, shown in orange. It was even higher above the ecliptic, even though the plane of its orbit was at a lower angle than Green's, because it was much further along. This illustration showed how much separation there was among all the objects. It showed Orange Comet almost opposite the visitor, and it showed how unlikely it was that any of the visitor's modules would have happened into that vicinity. Fran put in a line showing the maximum spread there would be in a tight radio beam sent to Orange Comet, and it looked as if it would be completely safe. But you can see why they wouldn't want to try to contact us, she said. They could probably make a logical case for it being safe, but some of the variables would be too uncertain. She showed a beam coming their way from Orange, and even though it missed the visitor by a wide margin, it was generally toward danger rather than away from it. With Red Comet being destroyed, and us being closer in than them, I don't blame them for being cautious. But then, said Winston, if we do call them, how do we know they'd receive it? And how do we know they'd reply? I've been working on that, said Fran. We will rely on the likelihood that they will have some antennas pointed our way, so when we squirt a signal at them, they'll be sure to receive it. Then, even though it will be white noise like some random pulsar beam, there will be enough of a pattern in it to trigger their apophenia. Apophenia? That's our tendency to find patterns or correlations in random data, said Fran. It's in our nature, and I don't think it's in the nature of the visitor. Apophenia, hey? Said Winston. I like that one. I'm going to file it away for future reference. He gave her a look. How do you come up with a word like that? I didn't, at least not by myself. I learned it from a statistician. In statistics, it's called a type 1 error. I like apophenia better, said Winston. Please go on. Okay, so Orange Comet will receive our transmission. They'll deduce that it's artificial, and they'll decode the first part that describes how to read the rest of it. The message will be in 2 parts? Yes. One part will be a kind of manual for reading the other main part. If it's so easy to decode, won't the visitor be able to do it too? Yes, said Fran. If one of them is in the area, and it happens to intercept the transmission, and it decides that the white noise is a message, it might be able to decode it, and then we'll be sunk. Said Winston. You say you were talking to a statistician. Did they happen to calculate the probability of all that? Yes, as a matter of fact, with lots of assumptions and big error bars, though. She consulted her notes. About as likely as me growing another set of arms, apparently. Not very likely, is it? A chuckle went around the table. So, tell us more about this message you want to send to Orange Comet. Fran told them, and Elgin watched her talking. He was grateful that she had this project to be passionate about. She was glowing again, full of energy and enthusiasm, and it was a relief after the first dark days. Fran's talent for feeling what people feel, and knowing what they need, was a pathological trait during the time of destruction and despair. Elgin suffered terribly seeing her in such pain, and nothing he did or said seemed to make any difference. While she was present at flashball games, which they continued playing out of need more than desire, or at the cafe, her mind was elsewhere. He could tell by the focus of her golden eyes. If it was distant, then she was thinking about what the victims were suffering. If it was interior, then she was suffering their last moments in her imagination. It seemed hopeless, but he kept trying. He kept taking her out among people, and he kept making her talk to him. Then one day, when he was listening to her describe how the people of Red Comet must have felt as they tried to hide, he happened to say, I wonder how the people of Orange Comet feel. She gasped, and looked at him with wide eyes. He saw her focus come back from her dark horizons, and he felt a little leap of hope. When she threw her arms around his neck and covered his face in kisses, he knew it was going to be all right again. Then she said the magic words. She said, Come on, we've got work to do. And work they did. They had a good run of 16-hour days, at it from the time they got up until they fell asleep talking in their bed. And they weren't the only ones. Fran enlisted everyone she could think of, and some who just happened to ask her what she was up to. The objective was to talk to Orange Comet. The challenge was to do it safely, without endangering either themselves or their sister comet. As far as they knew, these 2 comets contained the only surviving populations of their species, and it would be better to never hear from them again than to do anything that would threaten their survival. So Fran taught herself about radio waves, how they propagated, how they could be focused, and how a focused beam would disperse with distance. She got people working on the technology and the methods they would use, and what the message would say. And she began the development of the Rosetta Protocol, which would tie it all together. Yes, said Winston. You've mentioned the Rosetta Protocol before. Would you care to explain it? I'd be glad to, said Fran. First, though, I'd like to emphasize that I didn't create the protocol. I found people who are much better than I am at algorithms and so on, and they developed it. She looked around the table to be sure everyone understood that. Okay, The Rosetta Protocol is a two-part system. One part is a method of encoding and encryption. This makes the signal look like random white noise, and after it's made coherent, keeps it secure. If the visitor detects the signal and decides it is a signal and not just a burst of noise, then figures out how to make it look like a signal, they will still have to break the quantum encryption. My developers tell me the odds against that are too high to even try to put a number to. Okay, that's reassuring, said Winston. And the second part? That's got more to do with the content, said Fran. Green Comet and Orange Comet have been evolving independently since before we even got out here. Orange was out here for quite a while already before that. Her face got serious. Until now, we have had the common language of home between us, but that's gone now. She paused for one of those moments that descended on them far too often still. Then she shook her head and went on. Now our languages will diverge with time until one day we won't even understand each other. I've heard people say that already, said Nigel. After 80 years in hibernation, they felt as if they were waking up in a different country. That's right, said Fran. Thank you, Nigel. The linguists I've been talking to would like that example. She picked up the thread. So, we're going to need to keep up with the changes in each other's language. The Rosetta Protocol will help with that. It will explain things in each language not known to be in the other. It will repeat everything in the common pre-diaspora language of home, and it will include current lexicons defined in pre-diaspora, any new words that have popped up on one comet or the other. Like FA? Asked Elgin. Yes, exactly like FA. It's very unlikely that Orange Comet is using FA for first approximation as well. That would be too much of a coincidence. So we would have to use first approximation in any message, but then we would also have a definition of FA, as in FA, infinity and the infinitesimal are equally distant. So, said Winston, the Rosetta Protocol would take care of encoding and encryption, while also keeping our languages comparable. Yes. I think you've explained it very well. Winston prepared to move on to the vote. There's one more thing, said Fran. Go ahead. Even with all the safety and security built in, Orange Comet might not want to reply to us. They might consider even a tiny risk to be too much, considering the possible repercussions. I think we all understand that, said Winston, and there was a general sound of agreement. What do you propose? Well, this isn't my proposal, and as much as I understand it, it might as well be magic, she cautioned. They acknowledged that, and she continued. My communications experts say there is a new technology where they can use quantum states to code a message into a single atom. A single atom? How much of a message can you get in an atom? Winston didn't even question the quantum part. He agreed with Francis that it was like magic. They say they can get about 1,000 characters worth of data into one gold atom. She looked at Elgin and Stanton and Buzzard, the closest thing she had to science experts in the room. They nodded, and Buzzard said, 1,000 bytes, a kilobyte, 1,000. 1,000 letters wouldn't make much of a message. No, but it would be enough to give their position and velocity, which would mean we could keep track of each other. That made their faces more attentive. And there would still be room for some other information, like when to expect their next message. But the important thing would be making sure we don't lose touch. Stanton spoke up. This quantum stuff is over my head, but I can sort of see how it works. They told me that 1,000 characters is the minimum, and that they could increase it with some practice. How high? Asked Winston. Did they give a maximum? I'm not sure, said Stanton. I think they tried to tell me, but I got lost when they started talking about superposition. Everyone was grinning and nodding their heads. Anyway, the important thing is that it makes a viable way of sending messages, even if they're short. Yes, I can see that. Winston turned to Francis. Can you give a brief explanation of how it would work and what makes it safer? She had another video, a simpler one. They would build a particle accelerator, and use it to shoot a few billion encoded gold atoms in our direction. They would be identical, all with the same message. We would only have to catch one to receive it. Billions? Winston balked at the idea of wasting all that gold. Yes, said Fran. Space is big, and even gold atoms are small. Even billions wouldn't make a piece of gold big enough to see without a microscope. She consulted her notes again. They would accelerate them to nearly the speed of light, so they would be like cosmic rays. As far as safety is concerned, a random spate of cosmic rays is even less remarkable than a burst of electromagnetic white noise. Did anyone calculate the chance of being caught? Yes, said Fran. Well, more of an estimate than a calculation. They gave the odds against discovery as infinity minus 1. That got a good laugh. Final question, said Winston, and I think I know the answer, but the question must be asked. If it's so safe, why don't we use it instead of a radio to call them in the first place? If they didn't know what to look for, they would be as unlikely to detect it as the visitor would. It's only good if we're both aware of it ahead of time. Winston nodded at the confirmation. So unless there's more, she shook her head, I think I can recap, then we can put it to a vote. Do we want to send a radio message to Orange Comet, compressed, encoded, and encrypted by the Rosetta Protocol, advising them to respond by the cosmic ray method if they don't feel safe using radio? Fran nodded at the wording, and they voted by a show of hands. It was unanimously in favor. Everyone was dying to talk to the only others like themselves in the universe. Green Comet was a brighter place after that. When they announced that they were going to try to contact Orange Comet, people started talking again. There were lively debates when people met in the square. Some of them were frightened and just wanted to keep their heads down, but they were reassured by the majority who wanted to reconnect and keep in touch. The air once again felt warm, and it carried the sounds of children who immediately responded to the lifting of the mood. Fran was brighter too. As much as she was cheered up by the challenge of the task before, now she was luminous. It was as if the energy of Green Comet all ran through her, making her fluoresce brilliantly. Her aura once again shone with its characteristic clear light, and her radiance fed back and illuminated the rooms and corridors of the comet. They opened up the message to public input. This wasn't just an official missive from one comet to another. It was also about people reaching out across the cold vacuum of the warmth of touch. This was about declaring that the visitor had failed, that they were still here, still together. This was telling the universe that the people would go on.